I write in my journal a lot, like every day. I've been doing it basically daily for well over 2 years at this point, and my life has changed drastically because of it. At the end of each month's journal, I give myself a grade. Did the month go well? Did I reach my goals? Was my life meaningful for the previous 30-something days? Grading myself is a tricky thing to do because some months are just kind of miserable due to circumstances which were beyond my control. Other months, however, can seem super easy. Maybe they just weren't as meaningful because, I don't know, maybe I got distracted by things or I got lazy and unmotivated. But still, life during that time went really well for some unexplained reason. Again, for reasons beyond my control. Maybe nothing really went particularly wrong for that time period, but I just got lazy and sat around the house wasting way too much time. Who knows? In that type of scenario where I didn't do anything to make my own life better, but it was still pretty good, is that worthy of a good grade? I don't know. How should I rate myself in these different situations? Sometimes it's just kind of hard to tell. But I do tend to be easier on myself in these times where I wasn't actually the source of the problems which caused things in my life to be not so great, and vice versa. Grading myself each month is probably a somewhat odd thing to do. I seriously doubt many other people do this, but I do feel like these are important exercises that I use in order to help foster a better quality of life for myself. When I write in my journal at the end of each day, I am forced to relive the things which happened over the previous 24 hours, whether they were good or bad. It is a daily opportunity to think about how my life is going, to help remember the interactions that I had with people. And since I'm a horribly forgetful person, and I interact with tons of new people every day, it helps me to remember some of the names and the behaviors of the people that I meet. The grade that I give myself at the end of each month forces me to contemplate exactly how well my life is going, where my strengths are, and possibly how I could be doing better. The lower grade I give myself, the more that I have to rethink the direction that I am going in. But as I mentioned before, sometimes life just gets challenging. Due to the way that the economy has been going recently, the company that I work for basically decided to shut its doors and send everyone who worked there packing. I was forced to find a new job, and personally, I saw that as an opportunity to once again experience something new and amazing. For the second time in just over a year, I decided to move thousands of miles away from where I was before, and now I find myself living in a new city once again. And honestly, it feels like I'm a very, very long way from home. This transition and the turmoil that went with it, it dragged out for almost 3 months, and it was a very arduous time in my life. It was a bittersweet departure from where I was living in Florida because I was really, really very happy living near the beach, near the ocean, in a place where it's almost always sunny and warm. And while I still wanted to experience all the different things that this world has to offer, I had to leave the place where I found such happiness in order to seek out new adventures. But I was concerned. What if it turns out that I'm less happy in the new place? Is the desire for this new sense of adventure worth the potential loss of happiness that I found in the last place that I was? I find that no matter how happy I am, stagnancy will eventually catch up with me. And whatever happiness I found at first will eventually fade. If I'm not constantly exploring and evolving and trying new things. Though the experience of transitioning from the last place to this new place was pretty stressful. I had to find a new home. I knew nothing about the new city that I was moving to, so I really had no idea what to expect. Which neighborhoods would be nice? Which ones are bad? What am I even getting myself into? Then I had to logistically plan how to get everything that I owned from one side of the country to the other. I was really overwhelmed by all of it, and my anxiety, which honestly I'm always anxious, at this point was at an all-time high. I didn't know anybody in this new place, and I found myself moving thousands of miles away from the closest person that I knew. The amount of things that could have gone wrong during this transition were ridiculous. It was honestly a very scary thing to do. Probably actually one of the scariest things I've ever done. But I survived. I survived the journey. I found a decent place to live, a decent neighborhood with a little bit of research, and my crappy old car made the drive. I think it's like 18 years old at this point. It made the 1,000-mile trip from Florida to Ohio and then another 2,000 miles beyond that. The old place gave me like a ridiculous amount of money to go away peacefully, like a severance package. And in between the two jobs, I only had 1 week off. So it worked out about as well as I could hope for. And now I'm finally getting settled into this new place. Finally getting comfortable here in Salt Lake City, Utah. A few episodes back, I did an interview with a guy who went by the title of Alternative Mormon. His name was Tom. He actually lives in Utah. And at the time, we talked about the Mormon religion and why Mormons tend to flock to that specific state. To this specific state, I guess I should say. At the time, I knew nothing about either of those two things. Little did I know then that in just a few months, I would soon be living in Utah myself, and that I too would be surrounded by Mormon culture. I didn't really have a specific reason to be interviewing him at the time. I was just trying out new ideas for the podcast, and he spoke up, and alternative religion seemed like a topic which I found interesting to learn about. And he was an interesting guy, so we agreed to do an interview together. And in my opinion, it turned out to be a really good episode. I learned a lot. Right around the time when I first started this podcast, I also began this whole journey of traveling around and experiencing new things. I don't think it was coincidence. I was attempting to skip through the multiverse, like in the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once, where the lady just like jumps from one reality to the other. And she was kind of judging what one version of her life was like compared to another. And in a way, that's what I'm doing. Seeing what my personality becomes like in one situation versus another. I think it'll be interesting as I go back and listen to some of these episodes. When I first started this podcast, I lived in Ohio. The majority of the podcast for over a year, I lived in Florida by the beach, and now I live in Utah. And I think that it will be interesting to see how my personality changes from place to place, if it does at all. Maybe I won't be any different. And when it comes to nature versus nurture, maybe my nature overcomes my environment. Who knows? We'll see. Salt Lake City was never really a place that I actually intended to move to. I just sent out a bunch of job applications to a bunch of different cities, and it was kind of like a spray and pray kind of thing. And one company seemed like the best fit for me, and they were willing to pay more than most of the others, and they snagged me up the quickest. So that's where I ended up. Honestly, when I started that interview with that job, I went into it thinking that I was applying for a job in another state since it was online. But by the time that interview was over, I realized it was actually in Salt Lake City. But they made a great impression. And after a lot of contemplation and talking it over with my family, I was convinced that Utah was ultimately the place to go. It's kind of weird. The last 3 places I've lived, I didn't really intend to move to any of them. It was never in my plans. I just ended up there because there was work. Going back to February 1st, when I interviewed Tom from the Alternative Mormon podcast, I had no way of knowing that the things which we were talking about at that time would very soon become part of my reality, part of my daily life. And now it is. And to be honest, I'm a bit fascinated by the local culture here, as well as the influence which the Mormon religion plays in the overall vibe of the city. I've been asking all sorts of questions about the local culture here ever since I arrived, in an attempt to kind of try to understand it better. And I think it's safe to say that not everybody here is cool with it, as we talked about in that Alternative Mormon episode. Mormon culture gets a lot of criticism both internally and externally. But when I look around the city, my first impression is that there seems to be a lot of happy people here, probably more so than in any other place I've ever lived. I went for a walk downtown the other day and I really couldn't help but think about how culturally many people have been trained to think that bad things are good and that good things are bad. And let me give an example of what I'm talking about. I have a friend who used to get annoyed with me if we went out to a restaurant and I didn't eat everything on my plate. He would say that his parents always taught him, waste not, want not. Meaning that if one is not wasteful, then one will not be needy. And I want to be clear, I love this friend, and I am not criticizing him. This is the kind of friend who's been there for me most of my entire adult life. So this is not a dig at him, but I do understand the sentiment. I personally pack my lunch every day, and I get really furious with myself if I don't eat it all, especially the healthy stuff in the cooler, mostly because it's the stuff that's perishable and it goes to waste. Waste not, want not is an incredible sentiment. But my good friend, I think he was overlooking something, which seemed obvious to me, but not to him. His entire family, who had grown up under this waste not, want not ideology, were all actually very unhealthy. And the entire point of me not eating all of the food on my plate on those days when I ate with him was for myself to try to stay healthy and not overeat. Wasting food is truly a horrible thing, but to me, the waste not, want not saying was probably something that originated at a time before everything was made with corn syrup, when portions were smaller, and when obesity was not a nationwide epidemic. This saying, which once warned children about the problematic nature of wasting food in times of need, could now potentially lead to very unhealthy habits in a time of abundance. I think we could probably apply this same concept to other topics as well. Basically, in my opinion, a lot of people seem to blindly think that everything about the ideologies which they have grown up with, or even took on as adults, are completely good. Even if those ideologies in reality are detrimental to their existence and to their overall happiness, as well as the overall good of their society in general. Recently, I explored the new city that I live in for the first time, and there was a very nice park downtown. I saw a park bench there and I sat down and I started writing in my journal. There was a family having a picnic nearby, and after a while, one of the mothers picked up her toddler, walked the baby over to the bench that I was sitting on, set it next to me, and walked back over to her picnic table, which, I don't know, maybe it was 10 feet away. I'm not really sure because I wasn't paying attention at first, but I think maybe there was a space issue where they needed more room for the toddler to play. So they set it over by me. And this little toddler was just kind of content, sitting there beside me. Nobody was expecting me to interact with the kid or anything. We were just sitting beside each other. And while I wrote in my journal, this cute little girl ate her carrot and she watched cartoons on her tablet while she sat next to me. This whole experience fascinated me. How could this woman possibly trust her kid with me? A strange man in a downtown city park. At certain points, none of the parents were even looking in the toddler's direction. And they didn't seem like bad parents. They actually seemed like very good parents. At one point, the kid was watching TV upside down for some strange reason. For a few seconds. Because kids are weird. And she looked like she was going to somersault off the bench and bang her head on the pavement below. And I sat there kind of like half attentive, watching out for her out of the corner of my eye, just in case I needed to reach out and grab her before she fell. It is really weird how society brainwashes us to believe that everyone is evil, and in this case, including ourselves. I was literally frustrated by this woman for leaving this kid beside me, because who knows who I might be. But it doesn't make any sense for me to feel that way because I know exactly who I am. I am the guy who was carefully monitoring this child for that short moment when I thought she was in danger, so that she didn't hurt herself. And the mother probably understood from observing my body language before she set that kid there that I was not a bad person. And yet, I was annoyed with her for placing her child in what I considered to be potential danger when I knew full well that the toddler was never in danger because I was right there to protect it the entire time. This is how much our society teaches us to distrust ourselves and to distrust one another. So much that we could actually be angry with somebody else for having good faith in us, which makes no sense at all. The actions of the extreme worst types are projected onto the average person. And we are so jaded that we have not only learned to accept it, but we have also learned to expect it. Not only have we learned to expect it, but we demand it to our own detriment and to society's detriment. I really appreciated that stranger having faith in me. Although I have to admit, the thought crossed my mind for just a split second, didn't last very long. If this toddler does fall, somersault over head first onto the ground, should I just let her fall? Because what if the parents don't actually see her falling and all they see is me grabbing her? Could I potentially be considered a bad guy? That's how paralyzing cultural norms can be. So much that it can cause a person to fear doing what they know in their heart is the right thing to do. Before I made this conversation into a podcast, I actually shared this story of this little kid online to see if people thought it would be interesting, and I actually got a lot of positive responses. One person responded and said, "I think what you have experienced is the mindset of a family from a high-trust society." And I didn't know what that means, so I looked it up. A low-trust society is defined as one in which interpersonal trust is relatively low and they do not have shared ethical values. Conversely, a high-trust society is one where interpersonal trust is relatively high and where shared ethical values are strongly shared. A lot of people on that website spoke up with similar insights. One person said, "This mostly irrational fear that you've been indoctrinated into is distinctly an American cultural fear, and in many other countries, this sense of stranger danger doesn't even exist." Another person mentioned that stranger danger is mostly ridiculous because 80% of kidnappings are done by people who are closest to the family, and that the vast majority of strangers out there have no interest whatsoever in stealing other people's babies. And I thought, imagine living in a culture where you don't have to have a moment of hesitation before deciding whether to potentially save a toddler from harm, because maybe if you do, somebody might potentially think the wrong thing about you. My culture in this situation has taught me to be somebody that I do not want to be. It's taught me to do the opposite of what I feel is the best thing. The older that I get and the more that I experience, the more that I wonder if my culture is lacking some of the good things that other cultures have. Sometimes I wonder if the culture that I come from is even flat out wrong about some things. Maybe about a lot of things. In addition to the job that I recently accepted in Utah, I was also offered a job close to my hometown back in Ohio, which I eventually turned down after deciding to take the position in Salt Lake. On my way to Utah, I went on my way to visit family in rural Ohio, and curiosity got the best of me. And so when I went to visit my family, I visited that town where I turned down the job, and I looked around when I got there, and it seemed like most people there seemed like they had lived a pretty hard life, that they had been worn hard by life. Obesity is rampant there, and many people there just don't seem like they care about anything at all. I went to visit my family there later that day who still live there near the area where I grew up, and I asked them, why do so many people in town look so rough? And I tried explaining to them what I saw in the locals, but they really couldn't even understand what I was asking, and I was surprised by that. So I had to try to carefully navigate trying to explain the things that I meant by that. How is it even possible that they don't see it? Were they so used to it that they couldn't even comprehend what I was describing? And then one of them asked me, "Do you see that in us too?" And I wasn't sure how to answer that. Just like how they couldn't see that in their peers, I had no way of honestly answering that question objectively because I've known them my whole lives. I mean, I don't honestly think that they are rough, but I don't think I can be 100% sure. As I travel, I visit some towns and neighborhoods where 50-year-olds look like 30-year-olds. I also visit neighborhoods where 30-year-olds look like 50-year-olds. In one of those neighborhoods, the local culture might be one of healthy behaviors and self-preservation. And in another place, people seem to age themselves as quickly as possible. And it seems as if physical self-destruction in those cultures is almost intentional, which I don't understand. It's baffling to me. And I now find myself living in this new city where culture is actually a lot different than anywhere else I've ever lived before, where people seem relatively kind and relatively happy compared to a lot of the other places I've ever lived. I have a few theories about why this is, but I think that at least in part, the highly religious Mormon influence is one of the factors. And just like in that conversation with Tom from Alternative Mormon a few episodes ago, we talked about how no, their happiness probably isn't fake, at least among many of them. I believe that it's truly part of the local culture to be happy, and it's also part of the local religion. So I jumped online with some LDS people and I asked them a question. I said, I've heard a lot of bad things about your religion from outsiders and from people who've left the church. What are some good things from your perspective about your religion that you would like to share? The absurd amount of people who jumped into the conversation trying to get me not to hear anything good about the Mormon faith, it was baffling. They were basically just gatekeeping, overwhelming those who had anything good to say. I went into that conversation wanting to attempt to understand the source of where this happiness comes from, and these detractors wanted to attempt to force me not to listen, and they seemed to be even angry that I even asked in the first place. Just in general, from my experience of talking with people over time, some individuals, a scary percent of individuals, don't believe that you can even explore the ideas of some religions or cultures without jumping headfirst into whatever you're looking at, I guess. So they demand that you not even listen at all. I think that the reason why they believe this is maybe that it's a projection of their own tendencies, since they themselves are the type of people who tend to be easily manipulated and they wish to project their own weaknesses onto other, less susceptible people. And just like society in general, people think, how dare conservative individuals cherry pick the best liberal ideals and apply them to their own personal situations? And how dare liberal individuals take some of the common sense ideals of conservatives and apply those things to their life? Don't you know that you're being a traitor to your tribe? How dare you? But what is the goal here ultimately? Is it loyalty to tribalism? Or are we trying to attempt to find the most happiness that we can achieve as individuals? If you've ever listened to this podcast, you probably realize that there's very little chance of me ever joining a cult or even clinging to a popular ideology. But that doesn't mean that I don't want to attempt to understand what other people's ideas are. Because honestly, I want to cherry pick the best things from each culture and attempt to apply those things into my own life. I grew up in a Western religious upbringing, and yet I meditate every morning. Meditation, as far as I know, is kind of an Eastern religion kind of thing. And yet it is much or even possibly even more valuable to me personally than most of the things that I've learned within Western religion. Does that mean that I go to Buddhist temples and talk about chakras all day? No, it doesn't. Not at all. But if there are little things here and there that I could potentially collect from different cultures that might make my life better, why on earth would I choose not to implement those things into my routine? The other day, since I live in a new town, I chose to go to a new church that I'd never been to before. And I was so bored during that service that I just decided to leave early because I knew that there was this group meditation happening just down the road. And while I myself had never been to a group meditation before, I thought that I would try it out and see what it was like. At the end of the session, the leader of the group meditation asked everybody to talk about what their experience that day was like. I was surprised when other people explained what they felt when they meditated. The first thing that I was surprised by was that when other people explained what they felt when they meditated, it involved a lot of thinking. And for me, meditation is the opposite of that. When I am truly in a meditative state, I am intentionally trying to eliminate thought because my mind is otherwise constantly swirling, and meditation is a reprieve from that thought. The only way for me to turn off all the thinking is to get into almost a lucid dreaming state, like half asleep, half awake. So yeah, for me, meditating is basically being half conscious. But when a lot of these people started sharing their meditation experience, a few of them, honestly, probably mostly the ladies, started to cry as they started to share the difficult things that they were thinking about while they meditated. I had other things to do that day, so I was forced to leave pretty quickly. But on my way out the door, I overheard one woman say to another that she could completely relate to whatever thoughts the other one was having. And I could tell that they were starting to create a bond together. By contrast, I had just come from a church which was so dry and dull and impersonal that I couldn't even bear to sit through the whole thing. The Christian church that I had visited earlier that day, which was part of the religion with the ideals that I grew up with, was basically just a concert and a lecture. It was a few people performing for an audience. It was cold and rehearsed and non-interactive, just like entertainment, like paying for a ticket to go to a concert where you get no voice. And I want to be perfectly clear, I'm not criticizing this church. They were all actually young people with pretty great intentions. However, meditation, which comes from Eastern religion, the religion that I did not grow up with, on that day provided warmth and kindness, something that my religion did not provide on that day. Meditation was not part of my religious upbringing. In fact, when I was a kid, I used to think that meditation was stupid, and I made fun of it. And I have to imagine that my mentality at the time was somehow influenced by my culture's fear of other ones. And yet, once I grew up and started to understand the benefits of the best parts of meditation, the parts that I personally find most useful, it changed my life so very much in ways which my personal upbringing didn't bring to the table. They didn't offer this aspect of positive mental health at all. Tribalism creates fear of other cultures. And fear at times, at least in my opinion, can prevent an individual from bringing good things into their life that might potentially make things better. Why on earth would we intentionally deprive ourselves of things that might make our lives more meaningful? What information and insights are we intentionally excluding from our lives due to tribalism, due to narratives, because of our upbringing and the expectations that others have of the way we act, because of the way that people inside our tribe would judge us if we break away from our cultural norms? Is being considered weird because you live life differently than the people from your tribe, is it really all that awful? Is not being considered weird by members of your tribe ultimately worth the sacrifice of not living a potentially overall better existence? Personally, I'd rather be considered weird and happy than normal and miserable. I prefer to take the best things from each culture and implement them into my life. And I like to try to eliminate the bad things as much as possible. And if that's considered some sort of mutiny by my tribe, then so be it. As for anyone who might take offense to that, I guess that's just okay. Just keep living your life the way that you wish. I don't need you to think the way that I think. I don't need for you to be happy for me to be happy. And if you are happy living your life the way that you want to live it, then I am happy for you. If you aren't hurting anyone else, then I believe that everyone should be allowed to be happy using what other methods you feel fits your life. Why would anybody demand that another person live their life in an unhappy manner in order to appease another? I don't get it. You've been listening to The Great Beginner Galactic. Have a great day, everybody. Thanks for listening to the show. The Great Beginner Galactic can be heard on Spreaker, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, Apple iTunes, and anywhere else that podcasts can be heard. If social media is your thing, you can follow the program on Facebook or Twitter. If you enjoy the show, upvote, share, like, and subscribe. Whenever and wherever those things can be done. If you'd like to send feedback, the easiest way to do that is to email the show at tgbiuniverse@gmail.com, TGBI as in the Great Big Intergalactic, or you can leave a voicemail at 216-200 7940. Contributions could include written feedback, audio submissions, voicemails, or potentially even live guests. It was great having you today, and see you next time.